talking about the current issue that has been going on for about a year and a half now. But I wanted to, before we do that, be able to do a presentation that shows you how we got to where we are. Because I know a lot of people, they have some ideas of, what's going on or how it happened, but might not necessarily have the whole story. So I did a deep dive and did my own Palestine 101 self-discovery class. So this workshop aims to provide an in-depth and fact-based exploration of the history of Palestine, tracing its complex past and the roots of the ongoing conflict. Through a historical lens, we will gain a clearer understanding of the geopolitical, social, and cultural dynamics that have shaped the region. So our objectives is to provide a factual and chronological account of Palestine's history, to examine key historical events, agreements, and conflicts that have influenced the current situation, to talk about the role of regional and international actors in shaping the Palestine problem, and to encourage informed discussion and critical thinking on the subject. So the Palestine problem of today has its origins in policies introduced while Palestine was a responsibility of the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations. And a report issued in 1930 by a commission appointed with the approval of the League of Nations survey of the early history of Palestine. So the following is a summary taken from that report. So we're going to do this in three parts. So part one is an introduction to Palestine's early history. So talking about ancient Palestine, the Canaanites, Israelites, Philistines, and then the Roman and Byzantine periods, and then the Ottoman rule. So first, let's make sure that we all know where Palestine is. Situated between three continents, the region of Palestine, which also includes Lebanon, Jordan, and parts of Syria, has a turbulent history as a crossroads for religion, culture, commerce, and politics. And during the Bronze Age, the region was inhabited by Semitic peoples known as Canaanites. And the Canaanites established city-states influenced by surrounding civilizations, among them Egypt, which ruled the area in the late Bronze Age. So a quick definition: Semitic describes a group of languages, including Hebrew and Arabic, as well as the people who traditionally speak them. So during the Iron Age, when the tribes of Israel came to Palestine after their captivity in Egypt, two related Israelite kingdoms, Israel and Judah, controlled much of Palestine, while the Philistines occupied its southern coast, pretty much the Gaza Strip area, or within the Gaza Strip area. Judah and Israel were united into one kingdom by King David in 1000 BCE. And this kingdom reached its greatest height under King David's son, Solomon, who built the first temple of Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. However, after Solomon's death, the history of the people of Israel and Judah is a record of civil wars and struggles with alien tribes. So about 720 BCE, the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Israel and carried its inhabitants away as captives. About 600 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar attacked the kingdom of Judah, destroying Jerusalem and Solomon's temple in 567 BCE. So most of the inhabitants were carried into captivity. And 50 years later, when the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon, the Jews were able to return to Palestine. By about 515 BCE, they had rebuilt Solomon's temple. In 332 BCE, the Jews came under the domination of the Macedonians, who treated them harshly. In about 170 BCE, a Jewish revolt was crushed and the Second Temple was destroyed. Following the Macedonian rule was a period of independence to a certain extent. And this lasted until the Roman conquest by Pompey, who entered Jerusalem in 63 BCE. And Titus destroyed the city. All that remained of the Second Temple was the Western Wall, which became known as the Wailing Wall. So now we'll move into the Roman and Byzantine periods. Early in the 2nd century Common Era, the Emperor Hadrian prohibited the Jews from entering Jerusalem. And from that period dates the dispersion of Jews throughout the world. Since then, until the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, no Jewish government had existed in Palestine. Although some Jews have always lived in Palestine, their numbers have fluctuated depending on the tolerance of the successive rulers. So after the partition of the Roman Empire in the year 400, Common Era, Palestine was under Byzantine's rule until the Arab conquest in 637 CE. On the then deserted site of Solomon's Temple, the Mosque of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock were constructed and called Haram el-Sharif. Second only to Mecca and Medina, Haram el-Sharif became a place of great sanctity for the Muslims. After the Crusades, which took place from 1099 to 1190, Saladin, the Arab ruler, invited the Jews to return to Palestine. So now we'll get into the Ottoman rule. In 1517, the Turks conquered the country and ruled it until the end of the First World War. Throughout this period, the Wailing Wall continued to be a place of devotion for the Jews. And in late 1917, British forces occupied Palestine. Thus, it can be seen that except for Christian rule during the Crusades, Palestine was ruled by Arabs and then by Turks for over 1,300 years following the Byzantine era. The population of Palestine was mostly Semitic Arab, both Muslim and Christian, and there were also a small number of Semitic Jews. Both the Arabs and the Ottoman Turks accorded the Jews the right to continue to worship and to keep alive the Jewish spiritual link with Palestine. During the 19th century, the Ottomans authorized small settlements of Jewish immigrants from European countries where anti-Jewish discrimination was increasing. At the time of the British occupation in 1917, Jews formed less than a tenth of the population of Palestine. 9/10 were Arab, both Muslim 80% and Christian 10%. And the traditions, customs, and language of the Arab Palestinians constituted the predominant culture of Palestine. So there's the prehistory. So let's go into part 2, the British Mandate and the rise of nationalism. And we'll talk about World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Balfour Declaration, and the British Mandate of Palestine. So, during the First World War, Britain and its allies looked for support against Germany and its ally, the Ottoman Empire. Since some Arab leaders at the time were seeking independence from Ottoman rule, Anglo-Arab collaboration was a natural outcome. Accordingly, agreements were reached in 1915 between the Sharif of Mecca, acting as the spokesman for the Arabs, and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, who negotiated for the British. The Sharif demanded recognition of independence of all Ottoman Arab territories, including Palestine. McMahon, however, tried to exclude Palestine by using ambiguous references to the extent of the areas concerned. So the Sharif rejected McMahon's attempt, and the controversy continued until 1939, when the British government conceded that in 1917 they were not free to dispose of Palestine. In fact, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret Anglo-French agreement on the recognition of Arab independence, had excluded independence for Palestine and instead had specified an international administration. So let's talk about Balfour. The future of Palestine was also the subject of separate assurances given by the British government to the World Zionist Organization. In 1897, the organization had declared its aim to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. So under the leadership of Theodor Herzl, the Zionist organization had considered areas in East Africa and Argentina as sites for the Jewish national home. However, it finally decided on Palestine, claiming it as a national home on the basis of ancient Jewish links with the Holy Land. Zionist leaders worked for support from the British government, emphasizing the strategic advantage of gaining a new ally that would help guard the Suez Canal. So the British, still seeking support in their war effort, reacted favorably. And according to the Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour, he addressed a letter on November 2nd, 1917, to the World Zionist Organization. And this letter, which came to be known as the Balfour Declaration, stated that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So some Jewish communities, sensing a conflict of loyalty with their own countries of citizenship, opposed the Zionist plans. And Sir Edward Montagu, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, strongly criticized it. Even Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader just 10 years later, was to write, "The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was built on air. Every day and every hour of these last 10 years, when opening the newspapers, I thought, whence will the next blow come? And I trembled lest the British government would call me and ask, tell us, what is this Zionist organization? Where are they, your Zionists? The Jews, they knew we were against us. we stood alone on a little island, a tiny group of Jews with a foreign past. So to counter Arab protests against this new policy, an Anglo-French declaration reiterated promises for complete independence for the Arabs. The Declaration of November 1918 assured the Arabs of the complete and definite emancipation of the Arab peoples and the establishment of national government and administrations deriving their authority from the initiatives and free choice of the indigenous populations. So despite the assurances made in the November Declaration, Palestine's subsequent history was to show that the wishes of the vast majority of the indigenous people of Palestine counted for little. Their land had been promised to another people by a foreign government, which at that time held no sovereign rights over Palestine. Citing these factors, several authorities have asserted that the Balfour Declaration had no binding or legal effect beyond being a statement of the intentions of one government. So let's go on to the British Mandate of Palestine. By being made part of the Palestine Mandate, the Balfour Declaration was given an international dimension. The mandate concept itself was a compromise between the prevailing colonial system and the principle of self-determination of people under foreign rule, a principle championed by President Woodrow Wilson. So following the victory of Britain and her allies in the First World War, the mandate system of the League of Nations placed many of the former subject peoples of the Ottoman, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires under the tutelage of certain victorious powers. The stated aim of the mandates was to guide the peoples ultimately to independence. So there were three classes of mandates, ranging in levels based on perceived degree of political advancement of the population as determined by the victorious powers. So all the former Ottoman Arab territories, including Palestine, were placed under Class A mandates. As the most advanced class, the Covenant of the League of Nations described Class A mandates as communities whose existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, while they received administrative assistance and advice on their way to independence. So Syria and Lebanon were placed under a French mandate, and Palestine and Transjordan were placed under a British mandate. And under the Covenant's provision for independence of mandates, the two French mandates achieved their independence before the end of the Second World War. Lebanon's independence came in November of 1943, followed by Syrian independence in January 1944. Jordan received independence in 1946. Palestine, however, became a scene of conflict. So the Covenant of the League of Nations required that the wishes of the communities affected be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. This, however, was ignored in the case of Palestine. On President Wilson's insistence during the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a commission was appointed to ascertain the wishes of the indigenous populations. And the commission recommended an American mandate over Syria, including Palestine. And in assessing the wishes of the indigenous population of Palestine regarding the Jewish immigration there, the Commission called for serious modification of the extreme Zionist program for Palestine of unlimited immigration of Jews. The Commission declared that this program, aiming finally to make Palestine distinctly a Jewish state, would be a serious injustice. Dealing with the Zionist claim that they have a right to Palestine based on their occupation of 2,000 years, the Commission remarked this claim can hardly be seriously considered. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, warned that the term national home really meant a Jewish state in which the Arabs would be second-class citizens. And he declared, "I think the entire concept wrong." And even Balfour himself acknowledged what was being done and noted that so far as Palestine is concerned, the Allied powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which they have not intended to violate. Nevertheless, the plans for Palestine moved forward. And in April 1920, at the San Remo Conference, France agreed that in return for freedom of action in Syria and Lebanon, Palestine would pass under British tutelage instead of the international regime as originally planned. Moreover, a stronger and more explicit version of the Balfour Declaration was made part of the mandate. And with the new version added, the mandate recognized the Zionist organization as the Jewish Agency, which would help in the establishment of the Jewish national home by organizing large-scale immigration and settlement of Jews from abroad on the land the agency acquired in Palestine. Remarkably, the mandate did not once use the term Arab. Although the Palestinian Arabs constituted 9/10 of the population at the time, they were referred to in the document as only the non-Jewish, or the non-Jewish communities of Palestine. Noting the irony, one writer likened the formulation to calling the multitude the non-few, emphasizing the obvious fact that the multitude was the Arab majority in Palestine. The only protection given to the rights of the Palestinian Arab majority was a phrase stating that nothing should be done which might prejudice their civil and religious rights. Any reference to their national or political rights, however, was conspicuously absent. So the mandate was signed on July 24th, 1922, and came into effect formally in September 1922. Although Transjordan had originally been included in the Palestine Mandate, on September 16, 1922, the League of Nations approved a separate administration for it. Consequently, the mandate thus applied only to Palestine itself, although the area claimed originally for the Jewish national home included parts of neighboring lands. So you can see there that a little bit of Egypt, a little bit of Transjordan, a little bit of Syria, and a little bit of Lebanon. So one of the aims of the mandate was specified as the development of self-governing institutions. However, a British government policy statement of July 1st, 1922 subordinated this principle to a secondary consideration. The statement, known as the Churchill Memorandum, made it clear that the establishment of self-governing institutions in Palestine was to be subordinated to the paramount pledge and obligation of establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. The contradictory elements in the mandate led to what became known as Britain's dual obligation to the Zionist organization and to the Palestinian Arabs. And this dual obligation was a contradiction that soon led to conflict between the indigenous people of Palestine and the Jewish immigrants seeking refuge there from discrimination in Europe. So we'll move into part 3, talking about the partition and the establishment of Israel. So the UN partition plan. The building of the National Jewish Home started soon after the end of the First World War, well before the mandate was to become into effect in 1922. The Zionist organization promoted large-scale Jewish immigration that brought marked changes in the population pattern in Palestine. The Jewish population in Palestine increased from 56,000 in 1918 to about 88,000 in 1922, when the total population was officially estimated at 750,000. And by 1939, the Jewish population had increased to 445,000 out of the total population of 1.5 million. So this dramatic increase was primarily due to the large number of Jews fleeing from the Nazi terror. In percentage terms, the Jewish population rose from about 10% in 1919 to 17% in 1929 to nearly 30% in 1939. The Zionist organization also acquired land to settle the Jewish immigrants. In 1920, Jewish holdings in Palestine were about 2.5% of the total land area. By 1939, they had increased their holdings to over 5.7% of the total land area. The Palestinian Arabs regarded the Zionist organization's activities to increase Jewish immigration to and land holdings in Palestine as colonization of their ancestral land by foreigners. So not yet politically organized, the Palestinians vented their anger through violence. Anti-Zionist riots erupted in 1920, 1921, 1929, and 1939. And these eventually culminated into a full-scale rebellion from 1936 to 1939. And the British government was only able to suppress the rebellion through the use of drastic measures and strong military force. In 1936, a British Royal Commission headed by Lord Peel was sent to report on the turmoil in Palestine. The commission declared that the underlying causes for the earlier revolts and the rebellion was a combination of the Palestinian Arabs' desire for national independence and their hatred and fear of the establishment of the Jewish national home in their land. It wasn't the hatred and fear of the Jewish, it was the hatred and fear of them creating a Jewish national home. Further, the commission commented that the forcible conversion of Palestine into a Jewish state against the will of the Arabs would clearly violate the spirit and intention of the mandate system. It would mean that the national self-determination had been withheld when the Arabs were a majority in Palestine and only conceded when the Jews were in majority. Additionally, the Commission observed that the conflict was not, in its essence, an interracial conflict arising from any old instinctive antipathy of Arabs towards Jews. There was little or no friction until the strife in Palestine engendered it. The Commission noted that Judaism and its rituals were rooted in the historical past in Palestine, and that some Jews had always lived there. Instead, the conflict stemmed from the Palestinian Arabs' rejection of the Balfour Declaration and their opposition to Zionist aims in Palestine. They did not accept the creation of a Jewish national home, and they refused to cooperate in any form of government other than a national government responsible to the Palestinian people. Yet, the Jewish community, in establishing its national home, had formed a state within a state in Palestine. And the Peel Commission concluded that the situation in Palestine had reached a deadlock where the dual obligations in Palestine had become irreconcilable. The British government could not both recognize the Palestinian Arab claim to national independence and secure establishment for the Jewish national home in Palestine. Therefore, the Commission recommended the partition of Palestine into two independent states. One state would be Palestinian Arab and the other Jewish, with Jerusalem to be an enclave under the League of Nations mandate. So you can see the whole picture and then kind of a close-up. The orange would be Jewish, and the pink or maroon would be Arab, and then that green spot would be under the League of Nations, and that included Jerusalem. Neither side accepted this formula. The Zionists alleged that it had violated the Balfour Declaration and the mandate, and the Palestinians refused to accept the division of their land and the establishment of a Jewish state on part of it. Further, negotiations in London failed. Then, in May 1939, the British government announced that instead of partition, Palestine would in 1949 become a unified, independent state with both Jews and Arabs sharing in government administration and rule. The Zionist organization rejected this policy. Instead, in 1942, they met in New York and adopted the Biltmore Program, which included a demand for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. By the end of the Second World War, the Arab states and the United States of America, who were also involved in the Palestine issue, in 1946, an Anglo-American Inquiry Committee presented yet another set of recommendations which the British government considered unworkable. Differing formulas were proposed during fruitless negotiations. Finally, after 3 decades of rule, the British government decided in February 1947 to hand the Palestine issue over to the United Nations. The British government declared that faced with an irreconcilable conflict of principles in Palestine, it had reached the conclusion that the only course now was to submit the problem to the judgment of the United Nations. Pretty much saying, we messed it all up, you guys take care of it. After 3 decades of implementing the Balfour Doctrine and a radically transformed Palestine, the British mandate neared its end. So the Jewish population had swelled from 56,000 in 1918 to 608,000 by 1946. The total population had reached 1.85 million. Much of the immigration had been due to the Nazi persecution of European Jews. Palestinian Arabs sympathized with the plight of European Jews. However, the sudden immigration brought undue hardship on the Palestinian Arab population. And since the Arabs were not responsible for the atrocities in Europe, they objected to being made to suffer in turn. And as the Royal Commission's report on it put it, an able Arab exponent of the Arab case told us that the Arabs throughout their history have not only been free from anti-Jewish sentiment, but have also shown that the spirit of compromise is deeply rooted in their life. There is no decent-minded person, he said, who would not want to do everything humanly possible to relieve the distress of those persons, providing that it was not at the cost of inflicting a corresponding distress on another people. So by 1947, Palestine was a land ravaged by violence. The Palestinian Arabs had reacted with violence to the policies of the Mandate, which permitted large-scale immigration and land transfer in Palestine. Initially, the Jewish immigrants often had practiced the doctrine of havlaga, or self-restraint. However, Zionist paramilitary organizations such as the Haganah and the Irgun became active, and they were later joined by the Stern Gang. These groups turned to terrorism in Palestine. In 1942, the British Minister of State was killed in Cairo by the Stern Gang. In 1944, a British official report states, the campaign conducted by terrorist organizations reached a new climax with an explosion which wrecked a wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. 86 public servants, Arab, Jewish, and British, as well as 5 members of the public, were killed in the explosion. Palestine was described as an armed camp. The United Nations, now the de facto successor of the defunct League of Nations, was only 2 years old when charged with the resolution of the problem of Palestine. And in May of 1947, the General Assembly created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. UNSCOP, UNSCOP. So UNSCOP and the authority to its link, so they created the UNSCOP and authorized it to link the European Jewish question to the Palestinian issue. This was done despite protests by Palestinian and other Arab representatives. They contended that other countries should also give refuge to the large numbers of European Jews displaced by the war. UNSCOP visited Germany and Austria in addition to Palestine and other Arab countries. One of the purposes of the United Nations is respect for the principle of self-determination of people. This principle was recognized internationally at the end of the First World War and was extended to other Arab territories placed under mandates. However, the principle in effect was not applied to the British mandate in Palestine. In its report, UNSCOP commented on this. At the time of the creation of the A mandates, the principle of self-determination, was not applied to Palestine, obviously because of the intention to make possible the creation of the Jewish national home there. Actually, it may well be said that the Jewish national home and the sui generis mandate for Palestine run under that principle. UNSCOP recommended that Palestine should become independent without delay. Its members, however, were divided over the form of independence. A minority favored a unified federal state with considerable autonomy for the two communities. The majority proposed a partition into two states, one Jewish, the other Arab, with Jerusalem as an international zone administered by the United Nations. A lengthy debate ensued over the two UNSCOP proposals. And during the debates, the United Nations' legal authority to partition the country was questioned. Finally, after intense political maneuvering, the General Assembly approved, with minor amendments, the UNSCOP majority plan to partition Palestine. And this is Resolution 181, Part 2 of November 29, 1947, known generally as the Palestine Partition Resolution. So the British mandate over Palestine was to end, and the two new states, one Arab, one Jewish, were to achieve independence on May 15th, 1948. The partition resolution provided for elaborate safeguards for the rights of minorities and for the existing rights of various religions in Jerusalem, which had been secured during the Ottoman period. Included was the guarantee of free access for persons of all faiths to the holy places located in Jerusalem. These safeguards were required to be given constitutional status by each state. So although the size of the Jewish state accorded in the partition resolution was smaller than the Zionist organization had hoped for, the organization had secured its objective of a Jewish state in Palestine. Hence, the Zionist organization accepted the partition plan. The Palestinian Arabs and the other Arab countries rejected the resolution as unjust and illegal. The violence which had subsided during the United Nations while the United Nations debated the Palestine issue now flared up again. The violence intensified when the British forces first prepared to withdraw, and then when they advanced their withdrawal date to May 15, 1948. On the one side, Zionist forces went on the offensive, implementing Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet was to occupy the areas allotted to the Arab states as soon as British authority weakened. And the Zionist intention was to secure a state made larger and Jewish by the Haganah. Those are one of the paramilitary groups formed by the Zionists. On the other side, Palestinian Arab irregulars also intensified their operations. Violence spread, and the main sufferers were Palestinian civilians. On May 14, 1948, amidst mounting strife, the State of Israel proclaimed its establishment on the basis of the Zionist program, the Balfour Declaration, the Mandate, and the Partition Resolution. And as the last British troops ceremonially departed the following day, troops from bordering Arab countries entered the areas allotted to the Arab state, and the First Israel-Arab War began. By the time the United Nations Security Council effected a ceasefire, Israeli forces had established a decisive superiority. Additionally, they controlled large areas of territory that was allotted to the Arab state, as well as the western half of Jerusalem, originally meant for internationalization. So as you can see, we started pre-1947. We have Palestine with Jewish areas, that's the white, within Palestine. Then you have the partition plan that was denoted by the UN. And then after the war, Jewish people created a much larger area. And that's what it has been, well, up through 1967. So you have Gaza Strip and West Bank. The present is pre-2022. So the armistice lines established in 1949 left Israel controlling a total of 67% of the territory of Palestine. Egypt and Jordan administered the remaining territorial portions allotted for the Arab state in the partition resolution. The Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt and the West Bank by Jordan, which was not then a United Nations member. Of the two states intended by the partition resolution, only one, the Jewish state of Israel, has been established. However, the second, the Arab state in Palestine, had not come into being. So this is as far as I'm going to go for today. It's a lot, and trying to go any further just gets to be too much information. But you get a sense of how we got to where we are. Pretty much it is someone sticking their nose in that has a agenda, and then trying to work their way through that. Is it any one side's fault? There's a lot to look at there. I mean, it does make sense that the Jewish people should have a place that they can call home, because otherwise they do not. They did not have a place to call home, and that's what the Zionists were trying to do. However, when it's done in a way that you're going to expel people from the land that they were in for millennia, that becomes problematic.